God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this simple world as it is, and not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. I want us to go through the commitments of presence, and I'm going to assign you a letter. And if you would read that sentence or that section from that letter. So Rita, I'm going to give you A. Greg, I'm going to give you B. Wendy, I'm going to give you C. Kitty, I'm going to give you D. Jack, I'm going to give you E. Hillary, F. John, G. Nancy, I'm going to give you H. Julie, I. And Nakamura's, if one of you would do the letter J from the handout.
Josh, can you send the agenda or the document out in the chat?
Yeah, I emailed them out earlier this morning too. Let me.
Thing.
And all right. Oh, I can't send it because I have it open. Let me try it again. Here it comes, John.
Got it. Thank you.
And okay, so Rita, would you get us started?
Be fully present. Set aside the usual distractions of things undone from yesterday, things to do tomorrow, and things impinging on the present through technology.
Listen generously. Listen intently to what is said. Listen to the feelings beneath the words. Listen to each other as you would listen to Scripture, attentively, mindfully, and open to the holy.
We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are more or less important than another's.
You're on mute, Mom.
It is never share or die. You will be invited to share stories, but you will determine the extent to which you want to participate.
No fixing. We are not here to change someone else's mind or fix things.
Suspend judgment. By creating a space between judgments and reactions, we can listen to another person and to ourselves more fully.
Turn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental or cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what they are feeling right now.
Practice confidentiality care. What is said here stays here, but what is learned here goes out.
Welcome discomfort and dislocation. Move against an instinct to construct a mental space of safety or check it out. Tommy Julianne McBrayer.
Nakamura's number G, letter G. If you'll unmute.
We haven't received the handouts yet.
Oh, you know, I'm sorry. I'll read J. Love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger. Release the compulsion to answer them or to have them answered. And I emailed them out this morning in the 6 o'clock hour, and then I just put it in the chat, and I will put it in the chat once again just now. That way everybody has it in the chat. So part of what I wanted to have us do, and I think the way that is important for us to engage in a topic that, as I mentioned before, what we have today begins to be kind of lightning rod, and they're only going to get more difficult in the weeks ahead. And so that's why I think it's important for us to go through kind of these commitments of presence and beginning to establish what are some of the ways in which we can have not necessarily a safe place, but an intentional, thoughtful space of respect and engagement. And I want to make sure that we go through those each week and that we honor them to the best of our ability. These chapters aren't very long, and so getting through them is one thing. The flow of pretty much of what he has is some factual research. Again, remember, the book was written in 2008, so it is coming out of a particular time context. And while I think many of the facts probably would update well, some of the historical references, obviously we're not in the Iraq War anymore, which is one of the chapters for today. The concept of red letter Christians is one that holds throughout the time from when it was written to now. And if you remember, some of what he was arguing from last week was the idea that those who are red letter Christians, those who would live according to the red letters of strive to live according to the red letters of the Bible, as well as when we go to the ballot box, when we go to vote, that I think Campolo would be the first to tell you that you're not walking into the ballot box representing a political party. You're walking into the ballot box representing your Christian identity and faith, and that you are voting for candidates that are the closest aligned with the red letters of the Gospels. Traditionally, those words ascribed to the words of Jesus. And so with that as a filter, part of what we're now going to be getting into today, tomorrow, and the weeks ahead are looking at some of these major issues that become platforms for candidates. And what Campolo would argue, I believe would argue, is that you are not aligning yourself with a candidate based on one or two issues, and also being immovable based on a one or two issue, that, oh, I align with this one candidate on this one issue, and I'm not going to argue about it. I'm not going to research about it. And I don't care about all the rest of the things. It's just this one issue. But that part of our faith, when we approach the process of elections, is getting to know who's on the ballot and what it is that they advocate or argue for is best in alignment with those red letters. So that being said, what I thought would be helpful for us as we're breaking down through these topics is to kind of begin to apply these three questions. And maybe these questions evolve, or we may rewrite them over the course of the weeks. But the idea is, as we read them, and we're applying these three questions as filters to the chapters we're reading, what is one fact introduced by Campolo that may have been striking to you? According to Campolo, who should red letter Christians, that word should have been how. How should red letter Christians engage this issue? That's my typo. And then what are your thoughts and why? And these are pretty open-ended. Obviously, everything is subjective, and in the sense of your answers to these questions. And that's okay, because it begins to help us better understand how to both engage in dialogue, but also how to reconcile what may be societal or national things that we would want to uphold reconciled with what we believe that Jesus teaches out of the Gospels. Okay, so let's dive into the environment. And as this first topic, and I'm updating my my bulletin, what's one fact that Campolo introduced in this chapter that you might have found striking or revealing, or a story? It could be one of the stories that he shared with regard to that. And you can pick any one of those three questions that you want to reply to. We're not going to go sequentially, but those are the three questions we want to use as filters. And what was some of the as ways to enter us into the chapter? So what is one fact that, or a story? How do you think red letter Christians would engage this issue? And what are your thoughts? And this is going to be open every time. We're just going to be open up for conversation. If you do happen to have the book and you do have the opportunity to cite a page number, that would be helpful for us, so that we are able to read from the same paragraph.
I had something that struck me. It obviously makes sense. It's when he was talking to the tribal chieftain in Senegal, and he said, we dealt with droughts for hundreds of years. We know how to live with them. This is something different. And I have an ebook version from the library. It was page 48. I don't know if that has any resemblance to pages in the books you're reading.
That's good. Top of page 48.
Yeah, but I thought that was pretty interesting. He said, we know that things are changing because this is not anything we've dealt with before. So
good. Thank you for sharing that. I think that was a striking story for Campolo, certainly. Very insightful. And I don't mean to be responding to everything that gets responded, but Hillary, John, and I, and Kitty, I'll come to you next. We went out and worked at a farm yesterday with some other members of the church, and it is an all organic farm. And not only is it a farm that uses no chemicals, but it is also intentional about trying to be a farm that is also healthy to the land itself. And some of what our tour guide director was sharing with us is the extreme rapid changes in weather, going from 80 down to 21 in the course of 16 hours, killed out thousands of dollars worth of crops just a few weeks ago, but also the way in which they were doing farming at this farm 10 years ago has had to go through a whole bunch of changes because of climate change. That the way in which the folks have been farming around here forever is, more difficult winters and more difficult summers, and that they're having to make a lot of changes. So that became an aha moment for me yesterday, as I read this about the Senegal tribe leader as well. So thank you, Kitty.
And I found the article on page 54 about Camden, New Jersey. I myself was not aware of this, how schools are built on top of landfills and the chemicals that are coming up through the soil, and how people have moved away and left that town desolate. I have been through Germany. I've seen the windmills there. Being from North Texas, I also seen all the windmills up there. I knew about those things. And I heard about the deforestation in the Amazon and stuff, but the Camden one was different for me.
Yeah. Lloyd's, how long have y'all been members here? Jack and Rita? What was the first year that y'all became members?
1991.
Yeah.
30,
so
y'all in the 32nd year.
Y'all may remember that this property that our church is on previously was that dump for this area, long before this was annexed as a part of the city of Austin, long before. So when they were developing this land was that place where you would So, so again, I read that and I thought, oh, I'm familiar with that story. Yeah. Rita, I'm sorry, did you want to say something else? You're on mute. Although I heard you through Jack's microphone.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay. I have my book on my Kindle, so I don't have a page number, but it's the section Other Planet Problems. And it struck me because I'm a gardener and I like flowers. And so I think about the monarch butterflies and the bees that are, you know, just going through turmoil, and fewer of them every year.
Yeah. Yeah. Greg?
So, you know, this is interesting. There's a lot that troubles me in this conversation. So I grew up in LaPorte, okay, right on the ship channel. I grew up with refineries flaring all the time, which thank goodness that's not going on anymore. I always like to say that explains why I have no hair, okay? My grandfather was a construction foreman at Sinclair Refinery. And I remember in the 70s, him complaining in his retirement that they were making the refineries put scrubbers on the stacks to pull the pollution out of the emissions from the stacks, because he thought that was going to ruin the refineries. Well, it didn't, and the air is cleaner, and that's all good. I've also been to Beijing a couple of times, where there are coal smokestacks all over that city, and the air is very difficult to breathe. So I get all of that, and we have to be good stewards of this planet. I get that. The thing that troubles me is I remember when I was in middle school being told that the world was going to come to an end because of nuclear winter, or the world was going to come to an end because of X or Y or Z, over and over and over. You'll die if you eat eggs. You'll die if you drink coffee. Oh no, you better drink coffee. Yeah, right. And so I guess the thing is that's troubling to me in all of this is the voice of authority that we hear. All right, whether it's through the media or through friends or the paper or the pulpit or whatever, that voice has given very confusing, conflicting messages over the decades of my life and tried to stir in me action and fear repeatedly. And so I'm not saying climate change isn't real or any of that, but there's a part of me back in my head that is a little bit jaded and cynical because I have been told all these other things that were going to kill us that didn't. Maybe we stopped them. I don't know. Maybe we solved it. But I think that's a problem, not just for me, but for some of the people who want to say, no, this isn't an issue. I think maybe that's part of where they're coming from, right? Because the voice of authority keeps saying, this is the thing you have to worry about today. And we get the same thing with the news about the virus, right? It's the first we hear about a new strain, it's going to be the worst thing ever. And then you start hearing, well, wait a minute, maybe it's getting more virulent, but it's less damaging to the people. And maybe this is the natural progression. And so it's all of these voices of authority. And I don't know what their motives are, right? I don't know what the motives are behind all the messages, but it confuses it and it makes it difficult for someone to discern when should I really engage and get going. And so I think that's a problem that has to be worked on along with the actual underlying problem of treating the planet correctly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's become a religion.
Yeah.
You know, and if you don't believe exactly what the protocol is, and they mentioned the Kyoto Protocol in the chapter, and if you disagreed with that all the way, then you are out in left field. You know, and one of the things that Greg mentioned about in LaPorte, I grew up in the Midwest, and I remember when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught on fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the acid rain that was a big problem up around Lake Erie and the Pennsylvania and all that area. And those issues were severe. They were big environmental problems, and there were steps taken to alleviate them. And we're kind of now in a place, like the Senegal. I worked for a guy from Senegal, so and he was from Dakar, so I have some sympathy for that story that led off that chapter. But at the same time, unless the Chinese quit pumping out new coal burning plants every other day. And India does the same thing. The problem in Senegal that's affected by that weather issue is not something that the US spending $1 trillion on and giving that to the Kyoto Protocol people is going to have any effect at all.
Julie?
I have to completely agree with the last two comments. And I'd kind of like to try in a way to answer a little bit of this. And so what is the driver behind this? Campolo makes the point that these particular topics, regardless which ones that we're fixing to talk about, are picked up by political parties. They're also picked up by activists, which are intertwined with the politics, and they divert the attention to those speaking the words that complement people's basic belief systems to garner their votes. That does, however, on the other side of the ledger, the aspect that these are not important issues is really paramount to what Campolo's talking about. Now, I want to make one more point. Keep in mind that this book was written 14 years ago. There are many aspects in this book that are completely erroneous. And we will get to that in time. I'm sure people have picked out some of those items. The overall position that he has taken is, which is what we're trying to study, is how Christians should react to these various things that come out. And I think that is what we need to do, plus the things that we just finished reading about how we're supposed to read this. And I think we need to be careful with that. A lot of the hot button stuff, though, in this is, in those 14 years, has been, in some cases, completely proven incorrect. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Julie. John?
So, Julie, thank you for sharing. I sympathize with Greg, what he said. I mean, I grew up when, you were living 30 minutes away from global annihilation during the height of the Cold War. And so I sympathize with people now that are, jaded, or, it's the classic, the boy who cried wolf, or Chicken Little, the sky is falling. And so, who do you listen to? Well, I mean, it's like the diet fads, right? If you don't want to change the way you eat or exercise based on the latest fad, wait a week, wait a month. There'll be a diet or an exercise fad that somebody talks about that dovetails nicely with what you're doing and justifies how you're eating or exercising. But the one thing you said, Greg, about, who's the voice of authority on these issues? I think that's the point of this class.
Right.
The Jesus, the red letters are the voice of authority. And, nowhere in the Bible does it talk about the science of global warming or, being good to it, but it does talk about being a good steward of the earth, and one thing, like Josh says, we were went out to this 20-acre plot of land, which I think they're working 3 acres of it, right? And every time I go out and like stand there and look at that, or hear people, and Hillary and I have a friend who is a regenerative agricultural advocate or consultant. And when you listen to these people, it makes perfect sense. But I sit there, and it's not the cynic in me, but it's the wanderer in me that says, if we changed our agriculture to do this and got rid of the big, the big farms and the corporate farmers and stuff, would we be able to feed everybody on the earth using these methods? You know, are they that productive? They're definitely much better for the earth, but would you be able to feed the 7 billion people on the earth right now? So there's the idealism in doing what we know is good for the earth, but then you're also saddled with the burden of, the other set of red letters, which is feed the hungry, right? And those types of things. But I think, Greg, what struck me when you said was, who's the voice of authority here in all of these different, punditry and all that. I mean, I think that's the basis or the purpose of this study. The red letters are the voice of authority.
Right. And I think this gets right to the question B that you've got there, Josh. How should we engage this issue, right? Because part of engaging this issue is doing something about the problem, right? Changing our practices, changing our attitudes or whatever. Part of engaging this issue is engaging with our fellow humans on this planet, because if we're only doing our thing and we're not encouraging and leading and bringing other people along on the journey, then we're also not really engaging this issue. So we have to be sensitive to how you find an opening to do that with people, how you communicate with them and bring them along without alienating and dividing, right? And it's not that none of that will happen, because it won't be perfect, but that has to be part of the engagement, I believe, or you're going to fail.
Yeah, and I think, Greg, I think part of the discipline of that as well is not saying, oh, Josh, she's just some tree hugging liberal hippie, who
Right.
wears flax pants and and just shames everybody with his $90,000 Tesla. That is not me by any stretch of the imagination. But the other's true as well, which is not just categorizing someone and dismissing them because they're from the oil industry. Our denomination, the PCUSA, has been having an identity crisis for 20 years about fossil fuels. And what should we say with regard to fossil fuels? And that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. But I think the idea is how do we both approach the table of the Lord together and submit ourselves to the authority of Jesus the Christ, and at the same time also acknowledging too, and I'm gonna say something here that I think is probably a wild statement, so bear with me. I'm gonna make an assumption that everybody on this call right now probably would accept that the world is round and not flat. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that's probably the case. And if you're a flat earther, hey, no problem. I'm not gonna deny that. I mean, I love you too. Julie, what? But we didn't know that before when? That Copernicus, right? Right. The earth was flat forever. We've only ever known of a flat earth until
Columbus
science,
and the butterfly in the orange.
right? Until science and the revelation of investigation began to reveal stuff to us. So, I mean, Julie had mentioned about the pandemic, and 2 years ago, our scientific community and researchers didn't know a daggum thing about how to fight COVID. Well, now 2 years later, we have a vaccine. We even have pills that you can eventually get from the pharmacy to help fight against the symptoms of COVID. Science has helped us grow. So true, the things that we said 18 months ago, science has helped us to say that better. And that has helped us in a variety of ways. Same thing with the environment. The one thing that I guess that I think about when I'm thinking about the environment is I know that production sludge, whatever you want to call production sludge, from refineries, from factories, this, that, and the other, did not come from the river. And so it doesn't seem to make sense to me biblically to produce or to distribute my production sludge into the river. And yet that's a pretty common practice. And if you have any doubts on that, just go to eastern West Virginia and western Virginia, and you will see our production sludge in water. It didn't come out of the water, but we're putting it in the water. And the same thing can be said with air and this, that, and the other. And so, you know, we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, when the whole world went on shutdown, that our cities around the world that are natural, I mean, you know, historically smog ridden, people got to see blue skies for the first time in their life. Yeah, that's closer to what God had intended. And John, your idea about feeding everybody is not lost on me. That's why zombie movies, and y'all hear me talk about that so often, are so captivating, because we are an urbanized society. We are not an agricultural agrarian society as we once were. And you're right. I don't know the damn thing about planting a seed. Everything I know about planting a seed and growing food, I learned yesterday at the farm. So I would be in trouble at the fall of urbanization. And yet, I appreciate, John, you talking about the authority and trying to that and keeping those red letters as a North Star as we're going through our decisions and engaging issues. Let's move on to these next couple of ones: the war, Palestine, and the AIDS pandemic. You know, he talks a little bit about just war at the beginning of chapter 4, and outlines some of what we have, we theologians, people with long funny names, have thought about with regard to just war. And he outlines on page 57, it was Augustine in the 4th century who provided the classical definition of a just war theory. In a brief outline, they argued that a just war requires the following conditions. Top of page 58. 1, the cause must be just, not mere conquest. 2, the war must be lawfully declared, no sneak attacks. 3, the war must be declared only after all other options have been tried and exhausted. 4, the war must have a reasonable chance of success. 5, the use of force must be proportionate to the desired ends, no intentional killing of civilians. And 6, the good accomplished must outweigh the harm resulting from the war. Was that new to anybody? Yeah. What was your thought process on that, Kitty, as you were?
I had not ever even heard that expression, so it was really interesting. And I wondered how that fares in our politics today. Do the politicians even consider this, or is that a Christian thing?
Let's let that question linger. And Julie, I got you coming up next, but let's live in that space of Kitty's question for a minute. Augustine, Calvin, these are obviously Christian theologians, and I hate always deferring de facto war questions to John Seaman. I just know that the man knows something about war, but let's let this question linger for a minute. Let's stay in this space a little bit more of just war as a filter for political decision-making process at the government level with engaging in war. What are, that was Kitty's questions. What are some of y'all's thoughts related to that?
Well, it's very subjective. It's very subjective. And what might pass scrutiny in one time might not pass scrutiny in the next generation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, John?
I saw Julie's hand go up, and she may remember there's sort of a required reading book called Just and Unjust Wars by a guy named, I believe it's Stephen Walt. And that list that the author presents, you just read off, Josh, was the first top of that list. That's just good policy. I mean, that has nothing to do with just or unjust wars. That's policy. But that last one is the sticker.
Yeah.
You know, the good has to outweigh the good that results has to outweigh the harm that's caused. And not least of which is, it's like physics. You have to choose a point of view to do your evaluation of the physics problem, right? Like the classic, you know, you're on a moving train, you can stand there and be fine, but if you jump off the moving train, then your perspective changes as soon as you hit the ground, right? So that last one is always the sticker. How do you define good achieved? And how do you define the harm that results from it? And that's where I think, you know, you get into, you know, the ethical part of the just war, the unjust war. I'm not sure that helps at all. But again, go back to the red letters, you know, and you know, try and discern what the authority is there.
Yeah, isn't it? And I always get the colloquialism wrong, so forgive me for butchering it. But the history is written by the victor.
Mhm.
So your perspective with regard to to that is, it may not be a great outcome for the one who loses, but then also the narrative of how it went also gets to get written and elevated by the one by one side and not another, which is why there's so much unearthing of in modern years, writing history from both victor and non-victor points of view, so that you begin to understand the impact. But go ahead, John.
That's a good point about the history being written by the victors. And in the past, there's been very good reasons for that. There's a line in that movie Gladiator. Some people just don't know when they're defeated, right? And so you get back into all kinds of arguments about might versus right and things like that. But if you look at, you know, Josh, I go back to that book about General Lee and me, the U.S. Civil War, much of that history was written by the South. And the post-war narrative was, you know, well, it was about logistics. If we had better logistics, you know, and that the fact that a lot of the post-war narrative was written by the losers in that conflict, our own civil wars, led to a lot of the societal problems that we're trying to get over today, you know. Just as an aside, but you know, that doesn't get back to, that was probably one of the most just wars ever fought, you know, for all the right reasons. But you know, I'm not sure where I was going other than to say you got to go back to the red letters and that final, that last point about, you know, what good are you trying to get out of this, and in doing so, how much harm are you willing to inflict?
Yeah, and I want to pull up Julie. You had wanted to offer something, and I appreciate your patience. I wanted to linger on Kitty's question for a minute, and I still think it's a question that deserves our heart and reflections. But Julie, did you want to offer something?
I have to agree with Mr. Seaman in that, you know, we both in our military careers have studied this ideology. The reason they teach that ideology is to cause people engaged in war, and this also is true of the population indirectly, that what they're doing is the right thing. The second part of that is that when you look at the wars conducted by the United States, we as a people do not like war and do not engage in it. Even for example, World War II, we had to be forced to take up arms. Polls prior to the commitment to the conflict showed over 90% of the American public did not want to enter World War II for any reason. So with that said, it leads me to look at this direction that he is going to go in this particular chapter. He is going to say that there is doubt, particularly in regards to Iraq and its invasion. Again, this all was written 14 years ago. That does not justify what we did there and does not mention why we reacted, which is the reaction to that war was to protect Saudi Arabia from the invading forces that were coming through Kuwait. Kuwait asked us to intervene because they couldn't, they were overrun. And so he completely avoids aspects like that. The point of the summary is that no one wants to go to war, but even God Almighty has directed different groups in those times to go to war to achieve certain ends. Now, of course, we have to say that our deity, whenever he says do X, we should be doing X. But in the red letter aspects of this, God never says, Jesus never says, don't go to war. Campolo makes that point, but he avoids the saying that there is going to be a balance at the end of it. And I think John alluded to that. And we have to wind up looking at the good we make. And I'm going to go back to Campolo. He says, did we make some mistakes? Yeah, we did. We probably shouldn't have occupied that country. We agree with that. But by the same token, here's a perfect example. On page 60, Campolo talks about, well, you know, he makes this statement that there were no weapons of mass destruction. That has been proved absolutely erroneous. Our troops were exposed to VX nerve agent, and some of the men died from it, and some of them still have health issues from it. They know that all of that stuff was shipped into Syria. There were reasons to go in there, but to use the war in Iraq as his key supporting point, is foolish. We have to look at other wars that the United States has conducted and the reasons and the outcomes of those wars. I rest my case, Your Honor.
Well, and to add to that, I think in addition to looking at other wars the United States have done, the war that I've studied more than I personally have studied more than any other is the Vietnam War. So when I'm reading this, Julie, I'm not thinking as much about the Iraq War as I was reading this, and my mind was going through what I've learned about Vietnam. But I think also one of the things that we must do is we must also apply some of that same rubric outside of the Western civilization. So so if these tenets of our faith help us to produce some guidelines for a just war, then they're to be applicable. They could be tested no matter who the two warring agencies are, and even historically. And I think, you know, for me, my takeaway, something that I have not thought much of, is the idea of what about when it's done? You know, it was the good outweigh the impact of the bad. And as someone who's traveled through a lot of destruction and seen the ruins and bombed out buildings, you know, there didn't always tend to be as much as that other side. there's certainly not the monetary investment in helping rebuild what has been destroyed. But there certainly is not as much investment in rebuilding. Vietnam being a good example of that. What's our Christian calling? And there may not be, there's not a concise answer. But if we're thinking through the words of Jesus, and I think this is where I know that I struggle. I have said this many times. Jesus was not a doormat, and neither should you be. I think acknowledging that humans are sinful and prone to sin, and humans from Cain and Abel, right, are going to war against each other and fight against each other. Acknowledging that, and I appreciate you know, Julie, you saying this idea that Jesus didn't say, you know, do not go to war. But Jesus also did say, turn the other cheek and to lend a coat and to go the extra mile. Jesus wasn't a doorstop, a doormat, but he also wasn't a harbinger of war as well. And I think that's where, as Christians, striving to live justly, this is where, you know, it's hard to be just a pacifist that would say, I take no violent action and we should all, you know, whatever. But the harbinger of war is also something that's the other extreme as well. John, then Greg.
Jesus may not have specifically said, don't go to war rolling over this. But I think back on, you know, Holy Week, when he came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, there were a lot of his followers that thought, here comes the war. You know, we are overthrowing throwing the Romans out, overthrowing the Pharisees, all that. And there's going to be a war. It's going to be a fight. And at the end of it, we're going to win and Jesus will be installed, you know, as the king here on earth. And that was obviously not the plan. And so, you know, that may be the best statement about when you pick up arms or not.
Well, and so what happened when Jesus got arrested in the garden, John?
Well,
what was the red letters that Jesus said then?
Put down your arms.
Yeah. Those who live by the sword, die by the sword.
Die by the sword.
Right. Yeah. And I think theologically, what I would take from those red letters is, if you are one who is always looking for a fight and the answer to your solution is pulling your sword, then you are traveling a path that is an opposite of what I've been teaching. However, Peter was still carrying a sword in the presence of Jesus, right? Yeah, he commissioned them and sent them out, right? Because we live in a dangerous world. Again, don't be a doormat. But if your answer to the conflicts that come your way is unsheathing your sword, you're missing the point. Greg?
Well, I was just going to make the point, and I remember this being discussed a lot when 9/11 happened, and our initial response to that. People are Christians. Governments are not Christians. So, you know, societies are not Christians. And I'm not trying to say that as, okay, that gives it a pass and the U.S. can do whatever the U.S. wants to do. That's not my point. But collections of people as governments at various levels take actions for the betterment of all that hurt some. It might be to widen a road. It might be to take land to build a school. It might be to shut down businesses to prevent a pandemic, and then people are without employment. Lots of things like that, right? And governments are tasked with that kind of hard decision, and yet governments are not Christians in and of themselves. So correct. Part of this this notion of war is, if you're living in a society that is honestly trying to be right, then hopefully war is the last resort that society has been able to come up with. And when it takes that action, it does follow these criteria, right? But you and I can't guarantee that. We can try and influence it and influence those around us, but we can't guarantee that. So I think there's a separation here for what I can do as God's emissary in this world to be an influence, and what I have to ultimately feel responsible for and guilty about. Because try as I might at the ballot box, I don't always get my way, right? I don't control this whole blooming thing, and y'all are probably happy I don't. So anyway, it's just something that goes into the mix here, I think.
Well, you know, but you also have the responsibility to hold accountable as well. So, I mean, yes, you individual, Greg, are a Christian, and you have theological principles that guide you as a North Star. And how can, like the song says, how can I keep from singing, right? So if there is something that you identify that is unjust or is anathema to your theological principles, we should hold our persons that we elect accountable as such and appropriately. So we should also never discount the power of sin. And sin is infectious. We may not be a Christian government, but sin infects our government for sure. And just as much as sin infects our government, we can let our principles guide us, our theological principles guide us to eradicate sin from them, which is why we have a system of checks and balances, which is why our nation was predominantly founded by Christian people and structured our government. Why? Based on their Christian principles. That does not make us a Christian government. It is just what we have drawn upon to form the society in which we want to live in. And yet, sin still dictates roads getting widening. Why? Not because it's social welfare for the betterment of the whole, but sometimes it's just good for my wallet. And
that happens too, of course.
That happens still as well. And those are things, if we noticed that and we found out that that was the reason why, we should hold folks accountable for that as well. Before I move on to Palestine, anybody want to, Rita, or you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just had a thought, because as I was reading this, we're looking at past wars, but my mind kept jumping up to the Russians lining up against Ukraine and what we need to be praying about now for the present.
Yeah, what do you think?
Well, it scares me because, you don't know whose finger's on the trigger and how they're going to react at the time. It just seems kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, no, I will tell you, yes, in Biden's press conference last week and what he said versus taking back or clarifying what he said, I don't care about all that business, but I'm not a military person. I don't pretend to be one. But yeah, I don't know that it's quite to the same level of saber rattling as we've had in other situations, but I don't know what measured responses mean or what's going to be the thing that triggers us into something more that I would hope that we could not be a part of. And yet I think I love the idea that you thought, well, let's talk about present and future skirmishes as well that could result in war, because it is a good exercise to look through the lens of history, through the filter of what we're talking about, but what good is it if we don't let it guide us going forward as well? And I appreciate that. Thank you, Rita.
Sure.
All right, let's turn to the easy one, Palestine. I kid, it's not easy. One thing I will say though is, and I think I've tried to qualify this last week as much as I'll do it again today, which is, I think this is a good book for a good invoking book for us to use for the purposes that we're using it. And I also think, and I think he would say too, nothing's perfect. But I do think from what I've studied, this is a good chapter that helps unpack some of the general themes and issues related to Israel-Palestine. And I will be photocopying this and sharing it with our delegation that we're just about to send to Israel here in a month. And as something, one chapter is just not sufficient to really unpack the idea of Palestine. But hopefully what it did is to give you insight into why this is such a hotbed, heavily combative area that has more blood that has fertilized the soil than water. I hope that this provided some insight to that. And I'm curious to hear from y'all if there was something new that was shared within what he wrote, or some insight that might have been striking to y'all, or an aha related to this chapter on Palestine, or what your thoughts were as a reflection of it.
So over the last few years, I worked for a company that headquarters were in San Francisco, but the main lab was in Tel Aviv. And I got to travel over there about eight or nine times. And like most places you go in the world, the people are warm and engaging, and it's great. And you can sit and have a meal and share a drink and have a conversation and work with people shoulder to shoulder. It's weird to be walking around Tel Aviv and have to get checked every time you go in a building, right? Just like you're going into the airport. And yet I was able to be there when the Super Bowl was going on and be in a place that, catered to Americans, and watch the Super Bowl and walk back to my hotel at 3 in the morning and feel absolutely no fear at all. Yet that same area, there was a stabbing from some Palestinian, that stabbed a bunch of people in a market, maybe just a few weeks before. So this sense of tension is just there. And although it feels very safe to walk around because it's kind of a rare thing. Got to go to the Temple Mount, got to experience the soldiers that were protecting the pathway through the tunnel up to the top, and got denied entrance into the mosque. As it turns out, they were arming themselves for a demonstration the next day, and that's why they weren't letting anybody in. So it's there, it's real, and yet listening to my friends and colleagues who are Jews talk about the conflict, there was a lot in what they said that might be the same way a South African of my age might talk about apartheid, or someone from the South of my age might talk about blacks or something like that. There was just a lot of kind of bigotry and hate and lack of understanding and all of that. And I'm not saying either side is right or wrong. I'm just saying that's that same kind of tension that's living there in that piece of the world. And they're fighting over that turf all the time. So, I don't think we're going to bring God's kingdom by establishing, the Jews in Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. I don't think we're going to make that happen. I think God's going to come in his own time. But so I don't get on that whole thing of we have to support Israel for that reason. But I do wonder how this conflict ever winds down, because it's been there for so long. So that's all I've got, just observations.
Thanks, Greg. Well, we were chatty Cathy on the other two topics, and this one was like, I'm not touching that one. We'll leave that one for Pastor Josh. He can talk about it along with his resignation letter. Yeah. What's your thoughts on Christian Zionism? He talked about that a little bit on page 76, and the concept of Christian Zionism. Was that a new thought to anybody? Was that a new concept, or is that something y'all had experienced before And if so, in what way, and what impact does that have on who we are as Christians?
I hadn't really been aware of much of that. It was an interesting several paragraphs to read. The first part saying that it all land promised to Abraham, it belongs to the Jews, and then other people are saying, but wait a minute, it also belongs to the Palestinians because they're part of the family that descended. And I think it said that, let's see. Trying to find where it said, yeah, Christian Zionists fail to realize a careful reading of the Bible gives Arabs as well as Jews the right to live in the Holy Land. And Israel versus Palestine, I try to look at both sides of things, and I struggle with this because you can see right and wrong in what both sides are doing, and I don't know what the path forward is going to be, because it's just such a big muddle, and everybody is so determined that they're the ones that need the land, and it's a small amount of land. So, but that Christian Zionist, that was something that was kind of new to me. So that was good to read about, learn something.
Yeah. If somebody were to ask you, what is Christian Zionism and what does that mean, how would you answer that? And not you, Nancy, anybody else on the call.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I always thought it was Christians trying to bring about what it takes for God to reestablish his kingdom physically on this earth, right? Prepare a place so God can come and set down his temple. Kind of the same kind of attitude that the folks around Christ thought he was talking about when he talked about he would tear down this establishment, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it's the belief that in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem would hasten the day, and with the rebuilding of the temple, the complete control and habitation of the land and seizing control of the land and developing it is what's going to hasten the return of Christ. And how do you do that when I think Campolo, and this was something new to me, which was the idea of when inhabiting the land means Jordan, Syria, parts of Egypt, the Sinai, there's a lot there that would need to be conquered in order to fully establish that. I've got a little bit of show and tell. Somebody raised their hand. John?
Yeah, Josh, I mean, I understand the concept of Christian Zionism and that. Well, since we're talking about red letters of the Bible, where does Jesus say, if you build this temple, that's when I'm coming back?
There's a lot of that, John, that would be rooted in Revelation, the book of Revelation. And we're not talking red letters, right? I know you are. We're not talking red letters, but the idea, the concept of that would be coming from more from the book of Revelation, and ushering in a new Jerusalem and a new heaven and a new earth, a new Jerusalem coming down from the heavens, is where that a lot of that would be drawn from.
So that's the city on the hill,
right?
And I mean, going way back, some people made what Reagan talked about. We'll build the city, that doesn't need to be literally in that piece of ground in the world.
Except that it does, especially for our siblings in the Jewish faith. That's the land that God promised and the land that was given to God's people, that land. And therefore we have there is a divine claim to that land that is ascribed to whom? The children of Abraham.
Right.
Fair enough. In reality, Israel was created by the UN in 1947 and numerous
You're
times.
talking man's terms, not divine
Yep.
terms. I mean, I'm only playing with you a little bit here.
I'd open myself up to it. Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, a Christian Zionist would hold more of the belief of God's claim supersedes that of man, and we should be enacting God's claim, that which God has created, that which God has promised, that which God has given to God's people, namely people of the Jewish faith, is what should be reclaimed and built up.
Yeah, but I think we've gone one covenant too far back.
Well, that is the tension, is it not, of people of the Christian faith, right? And Christian Zionist congregations, you will see a lot of American flag crossed with the flag of Israel. And a lot of Christian Zionists, you will see a lot of Jewish religious exercises incorporated into Christian worship. There's a conflation of the two there. And I don't have time to completely unpack that. It's just really weird when you see it. And you don't really understand. I was in a worship place like that 2 years ago, January of 2 years ago, and it was the last time I was in a place like that, a Christian church, but it was a Zionist church, and they have elements of Christian worship which you would be familiar with, and also Jewish rituals incorporated into that. It's just really bizarre. Let me do a little bit of show and tell real quick. These are some pictures. First off, this is the Temple Rock, Temple Mount that Greg was talking about. Underneath this dome, this golden dome, is a rock, and that is a sacred holy spot for people of the Islamic faith. And Greg, I don't think any at least from 2007 when I was there, no non-Muslims are allowed into the Dome of the Rock.
Our guide told us that if you were not Jewish, you could go in, and if you were dressed appropriately, so like no short pants or whatever.
But maybe that's changed recently. We were allowed to be in the Temple Mount, in the space all around it, just not allowed to go in it, at least in January of 2007. So maybe they've changed some of that. But you're right. Certainly no person of the Jewish faith would be given access. Let me give you another picture. And then at the base of that, so this is a Temple Mount, Dome of the Rock. At the base of that is the Western Wall. And this is where people come to pray. And so people of the Jewish faith come to pray. And there I was coming to pray, in this sacred space, it felt very bizarre, because this is such a sacred space for people of the Jewish faith. And I had the freedom to be able to be here to pray with them. And also, this was not an uncommon sight throughout that whole land of people walking around with their assault rifles, going to the most sacred of sacred places in Jerusalem to pray alongside the devout, with people, grabbing their backpack and their, what is that, John, an M16? I don't know. You just saw these rifles, these long guns everywhere you went. And so it wasn't just the security in and out of buildings. It was just people walking down the street on their way to the library. So as Greg mentioned, that constant state of fear and concern. And while you have the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock at the base of it, this stronghold, the center point of the Islamic faith, at the base of it, you have the Western Wall, this incredibly important place where one day the idea is that we will eradicate those inhabitants of the Temple Mount and then begin to rebuild the temple. The final picture is this is a 24 karat gold menorah, and it's 5 feet tall, and it is just sitting there in the Jewish quarter, blocks away, ready. This menorah, along with many other things, are sitting at the ready for the day when the moment when those who are in the Temple Mount are kicked out, and the people of the Jewish faith reestablish control of the whole of it and begin to rebuild it. The elements are already there. The idea of us being able to mobilize quickly and reestablishing the temple, that's palpable. So the idea that these elements are just sitting out in the open, ready to be moved on a moment's notice for the moment when we will excise the Muslims and reestablish the temple. You talk about that palpable sense of tension that is always there and always on the ready, is real. And I found that to be one of the more harrowing, is the right word, aspects of traveling through there, of, whoo, man, this could go. And you see that from 47 all the way to, last summer, with another kind of blow up last summer. But we're talking about Jerusalem for the most part. Of what we've been talking about is Jerusalem. We're not talking yet about Palestine, which is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And what life, I mean, Greg touched on it a good bit, what life is like in those enclosed areas where all ports of entry are managed by the state of Israel. No seaports, no airplanes, no airports, transportation, the economy's tanked, and life is quite difficult. What is that like? What is some of our responsibilities as people of the red letters to Matthew 25, feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, visit the sick and the imprisoned. And that, I think, for Kitty, and is she the only one going? Yeah, Kitty and the rest of our delegation that will send, I think that will end up being visual. And for those of you who have been before to that area, I think that will end up being a visual invocation of some sort of calling that the Holy Spirit will tug on us in relation to that. Sounded like going to the farm yesterday. For the members of Hope who went to the farm yesterday, you don't come back the same from the farm after you've learned this information, after you've seen and heard the stories and seen the work, etc. There's a tug of the Holy Spirit of how do we honor our calling as we begin to know more about the world in which we live. Does that make sense? Go ahead, Rita, please.
I just have a question. Are you aware if there are groups of people who are set in place or in practice to make the move into the temple at the last minute?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I learned while I was there. And a lot of the Christian Zionists who are here in the United States are ready for that as well. There's another point I was going to make related to that. Are they ready to mobilize? Yes. Are they ready to go? Yes. That'll come back to me in a minute, Rita. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Oh, tour guides. there's a reason why there are so many tours sponsored of the Holy Land, and why no one wants to hurt an American in Israel, because especially the Christian Zionists, they want to make sure that they can get as many people there to visit the Holy Land as possible, to further their cause, which is why when we were looking for a tour company, I was pretty cautious not to make sure that we weren't taking a tour from Christian Zionists, but to find a company that was really engaging on helping us to understand the complexity of the land, as well as the theological implications, not alone the geopolitical consequences of the land. Does that make sense? So I look forward to seeing what this group will come back and share on the back end of that. The last chapter that we read was chapter 6, and that was related to the AIDS pandemic. And I note the time that we have right now, and we need to pull to a close, in part because I have a meeting in 3 minutes, but also in part because some of us need to position ourselves and get ready to watch Tampa Bay beat Los Angeles Rams in an hour. But it is important not to just gloss over the importance of the AIDS pandemic. And I'm happy for us to visit again at the beginning of next week, as we're going to be jumping in to some other issues as well. So officially on our docket for next week is reading chapters, let's just say now, 6 through 9. So we'll pick back up on that. We'll go all the way through 9. I will do my better job in making sure that you have the correct link in the email. A reminder that we record this, and we'll have this available on the YouTube hopefully here in the next few days. There are 4 prayers that are available for us to close our time together. So may I have a volunteer to read through one of those prayers for us? Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, I'm going to read the last one. Oh God, show us clearly the heart of your kingdom. We do not protest even if our life is destined to lead to the cross, or if the way leads to our losing our lives. We will march in the face of distress and contrary winds. Teach us how to dispense with unnecessary things. Let us go forward without fear of death in order to fulfill our mission simply, surely, and steadily. Reveal to us our station clearly, and strengthen us to teach and guide by our example all persons, even those who are ruled by evil. We pray that you may find us worthy to work through us. Amen.
Amen. God's peace be with you all this week, and we'll see you again. Bye, y'all.